This
the Exile
conference
study,
will now be recorded.
for me, the Exile studies are a great opportunity and an almost unexplored field because they combine a wide range of disciplines: history, sociology, psychology, international relations. I guess that each of us can do research and analyze the exile from individual perspectives and aspects. Since I'm a political scientist and historian, I focus primarily on the exile politics and everything related to the topic: political agendas, political organizations active in the exile, political parties, propaganda, etc., etc., etc. And we will talk about this later today. I'm not sure how you define the terms in English, but the term emigration in Czech generally means the voluntary departure from homeland for economic reasons, while exile is the departure for political, religious, ideological, moral, and other non-economic reasons. That's important. Of course, in reality, it is often very difficult to separate these two categories. For example, the modern history of my nation dealt with the migration fairly often. Many Czechs left beginning in the second half of the 19th century to find better living conditions in Western Europe or in America. And the political exile or an exile resistance to a repressive regime played a significant role during both world wars, then after the communist takeover in February 1948, and later after the occupation of Czechoslovakia in August 1968. Now, let's make a very brief historical overview so that you have a better idea about the development of Czechoslovakia, the country that doesn't exist anymore. It's been 27 years when it split into two republics, Czechia and Slovakia. Although I have to say some American journalists, mostly from Fox News, still haven't noticed this fact and used to call my country Czechoslovakia. Now, let's move the presentation forward. Yep. The Czechoslovak Republic was created on October 28, 1918, at the very end of the World War I, when the Austrian-Hungarian Empire collapsed and was replaced by a number of independent successor states. The Czechoslovak Republic was actually born on American soil in Pittsburgh. In 1918, Czech and Slovak political emigres under the leadership of Professor Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, you can see him on the picture, later the first president, and also under the strong influence of Americans of Czech and Slovak descent, signed the famous Pittsburgh Agreement, one of the founding documents of the Republic. The Czechoslovak economy in the interwar period developed along the lines of the Western capitalist model based on the institution of private property of land and capital, free private enterprise, the operation of an unrestricted market mechanism, moderate social reform. The political system was based on a model of representative multi-party parliamentary democracy and was strongly influenced by the French, English, and above all, American political systems. The second stage of, let's say, Czechoslovak economic and political development took place between the years 1938 and 1945. After the so-called Munich Agreement signed on September 30th, 1938, Nazi Germany occupied the border regions with the majority of German-speaking population, and Slovakia and Subcarpathian Ruthenia, that was the easternmost part of the republic, declared themselves autonomous parts of the so-called Second Republic. On March 15, 1939, the German army occupied the Czech lands, transferring them into the so-called Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. The highly industrialized economy of the Czech lands was absorbed into the German war machine and remained an integral part of it until the end of World War II. With the exception of Subcarpathian Ruthenia, which became part of the Soviet Union in late 1944, the Czechoslovak Republic was re-established at the end of World War II. And between the liberation of the country in May 45 and the communist takeover in February 48, the Czechoslovak economy developed into a system which differed radically from the liberal capitalism in 1920s and 1930s. First of all, more than 3 million Germans were expelled from Czechoslovakia with the consent of the Allies and were robbed of their possessions. The key industries, such as banks, insurance companies, mines, heavy industry, were nationalized. Also, a three-phase land reform de facto destroyed private property. The post-war period was also typified by the rising power of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia and its orientation towards the Soviet Union. We can ask, what were the key elements of the communist success and the defeat of the Democrats? The case of Czechoslovakia shows clearly that the active interest and impressive display of Soviet power, in contrast to the West's hesitant policy, not only formed the background, but were the chief basis for communist successes, not only in Czechoslovakia, but in other Eastern European countries. Until the coup in Czechoslovakia in February 48, there was a tendency to ascribe communist success in Eastern countries to a lack of democratic traditions and to social backwardness. The presence of Soviet troops at the time of the communist coup was said to explain the passivity of the Democrats. But the Czech coup, or Czechoslovak coup, in February 48 seemed to be of a different variety. Czechoslovakia, as I mentioned, was widely known for its democratic traditions and minimum of social friction. Its highly developed industry was nationalized, as I mentioned, the land reform was introduced, and communists won the democratic election in May 1946. And all that happened without a revolution. And there were no Soviet troops on Czechoslovak territory when it happened, when the communists took the power. So what was the reason of the failure of democracy in Czechoslovakia and establishment of the red totalitarian regime lasting as in neighboring countries for more than 4 decades? First of all, the communists came much better prepared from their Moscow exile, where they spent the war years. They learned how to penetrate all important sectors, how to occupy crucial positions in the regional and local governmental bodies. They learned how to work with propaganda, how to convince the people with their unlimited promises to vote for them. After they won the election in May 46, they gained control over the most important ministries, the Department of Defense, Interior, Information, and Agriculture in the coalition government. And they were preparing themselves step by step for the inevitable conflict with their coalition partners in the government, meaning the non-communist parties. While the communists were receiving direct support and instructions on how to proceed from Moscow, the Democrats felt internationally isolated. Both France and Great Britain had to deal with the political crisis at home and the loss of their global colonial empires, and had only limited interest in Central Europe, which fell, in addition, into the Soviet sphere of influence, as agreed at the Yalta Conference between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin in February 45. The United States of America was too far away, and despite some, let's say, moral support from the US Embassy in Prague, the Czechoslovak Democrats simply didn't have the strong protector from abroad. Some of them believed that Czechoslovakia would, thanks to its strategic position in the very heart of Europe, play the role of the bridge between the West and the East, kind of a mediator or meeting point where imminent conflicts could be solved. The naive expectations of Czechoslovak Democrats that their country could be another Switzerland, independent, neutral with its own foreign policy, were quickly dispersed. The communists under their leader Klement Gottwald, we can see him on the poster with Stalin, who became prime minister, planned to take absolute power, and the communists were waiting just for the right moment. It happened to be the governmental crisis, which developed in late February 48. 12 democratic or non-communist ministers from 3 parties resigned in protest against the activities of the communist-controlled security police. In normal circumstances, the president would have accepted their resignations and held new elections. However, the communists feared defeat, so they used threats to prevent the elections, as did the Soviet Union through a diplomat sent to Prague, who threatened Soviet invasion if Moscow's orders were not followed. Also, the communist-controlled labor unions marched their supporters out onto the streets of Prague and other bigger cities. The communists also arranged a general strike. They took control in outlying areas and eliminated any resistance by democratic elements in the society. And then it was over. Democracy in Czechoslovakia had been defeated. The president, Edvard Beneš, decided not to risk a Soviet invasion or civil war and simply surrendered. And the Czechoslovak democratic experiment in the Soviet bloc was over, and 41 years of oppression began. Stalin directed the Czechoslovak communists to carry out purges, and the nation held the largest show trials in Eastern Europe. Over a 6-year period from 1949 until 1954-55, the victims of these trials included military leaders, clergy, Jews, democratic politicians, those with wartime connections with the West, as well as high-ranking communists. And almost 180 people were executed. Farmers, especially the wealthy ones, referred to as kulaks, were enemies of the new regime. And during the years of Stalinization in the early 1950s, farms were nationalized in what was called the collectivization process. No one could own more than 120 acres of land, and while the lives of richer peasants were destroyed, poorer peasants were excited by the new system. But the communists blackmailed farmers and threatened them with the imprisonment if they did not join newly established cooperatives. The communists also took over church property, closing down all 216 monasteries in the country and persecuting the clergy. And communist ideology permeated the politically based education system. Students in Czechoslovakia had to study subjects such as Marxism-Leninism. Applicants were accepted into a university if they had working class backgrounds, if they supported the communist regime and had participated in communist youth organizations, and we can easily continue. The fact is that this long era of communism, lasting for 41 years, had a devastating effect on the nation's soul and character, visible even today. And another important topic related to this takeover or seizure of power by the communists is the emigration, or better to say, the exile. Because from the moment of the governmental crisis and the following coup d'etat, the floodgates of communist oppression opened, and the first politicians, journalists, academics criticizing the methods of the Reds did not hesitate and left Czechoslovakia before they could be imprisoned. In the search for accurate data on this, we call it post-February exile wave, we encounter widely varying statistics. Some authors work with a very rough number, and I would say an overestimated number of 500,000 of Czechs and Slovaks who left the country between 1948 and the Velvet Revolution in 1989. I would say that half of it, 250,000, maybe 300,000, is a more realistic figure. Anyway, the estimate of the Czechoslovak state security, meaning the official numbers at the end of the year 1948, states about 8,614 refugees, or people who illegally crossed the borders and legally left the country. And for the period between 1948 and 1953, so the first 5 years of the communist regime, state security lists a total number of 43,000 people who left. But in reality, we are talking probably about 50, maybe 55,000 people. Their first steps in the free world brought these people into the so-called displaced person camps in Western occupation zones of Germany and Austria, and also in Italy. Most of these facilities were under the administration of the International Refugee Organization, one of the United Nations agencies based in Switzerland. And between 1947 and 1952, the whole refugee agenda in Western Europe was under control of the IRO, of the International Refugee Organization. In July 48, the IRO granted the status of political refugees also to the Czechs and Slovaks, with the same legal protection and benefits as the other prior residents of the camps, meaning the Baltic people, the Ukrainians, the Bulgarians, the Poles, the Hungarians. It is almost a forgotten fact that more than 10 million people in Europe were out of their home countries by the end of World War II. These included former forced laborers returning from Germany, expelled German minorities from Eastern Europe and the Balkan, and above all, people escaping from Stalin and from communist regimes, or refusing repatriation back behind the Iron Curtain. Therefore, the IRO and all humanitarian organizations and refugee funds faced an enormous task. The Czechs and Slovaks ended up in various locations. Let me show you some pictures. As you can see, the accommodation for refugees met only very basic requirements. We are talking about wooden shacks, former prisoner of war camps, military barracks, schools, factories, or even more primitive housing, such as tents or train cars. The newly arrived refugees were carefully interviewed by the International Refugee Organization and were given some degree of protection, or were declared ineligible for the protection. And the atmosphere in these camps was extremely tense, because there was a widespread belief that the Cold War would quickly change into an armed conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. But the time passed, and people were waiting long months or even years in the camps, were sending visa applications and waiting for work permits and transport to a new home. We need to understand that Western Europe still lay in ruins. The economy was painfully slow in recovering from the war in the late 1940s. The unemployment rate was high. French politics, for example, was confused by a permanent constitutional crisis. And suddenly the same countries, meaning France, Netherlands, Belgium, even Great Britain, were to be hit by a massive influx of immigrants from the East. Logically, they were not prepared for that, and the population did not hide their fears. So refugees looked beyond the boundaries of Europe. Dream destination number one was the United States of America, of course, but American immigrant quotas were very strict. So more and more people were going to Latin America, to Australia, to New Zealand, to South Africa. These countries were looking for, let's say, fresh blood and experts in the wide range of disciplines. Medical doctors, engineers, craftsmen, all of them had open doors to these countries. In my opinion, life itself in these displaced person camps deserves much further research. I would liken it to a unique microcosm, where you could have found prostitution, black market, violent and boozy clashes, as well as churches, chapels, libraries, schools, sport association, scout troops. To make the story short, the life of Czechs and Slovaks in the refugee camps was very interesting, and I've actually published a book now on this topic, which is available in Czech language for now. Sorry. In the DP camps, also the first magazines, brochures, and leaflets and newspapers were published, and the first seeds of political activity in the exile were born. Now, while I was doing my research on the Czechoslovak exile and its developments, I began to think in a broader way about Cold War emigres from all the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And I began to question how the Czechoslovak experience was unique and specific in comparison to the Polish, Hungarian, Bulgarian, or Baltic emigres. Because, as you know, the political emigration has played a prominent role in the modern history of all the countries in this region, as well as the, I would call it, the Eastern European ethnic presence in the United States. Between 1890s and the outbreak of World War I, the Central, Southern, and Eastern Europe accounted for about 70% of total American immigration. So later, the number of incomers from this region decreased a bit due to immigration quotas and other restrictions, but still, there were about 2 million Poles of the first and second generation living in the United States, almost 1 million of Czechs and Slovaks, 350,000 Hungarians, etc., etc. And after the Yalta Conference in 1945, a large number of political emigres who had already experienced communist rule were convinced that the Yalta agreements were not conducive to an independent and democratic existence for the Eastern European countries, and they decided to remain in the West and didn't return to their homelands after their liberation from the Nazis, and watched the irreversible Sovietization from afar. And as you know, communists backed by Moscow took power in Albania, Romania, and Bulgaria in 1945. Hungary and Poland followed soon after, and Czechoslovakia fell as the very last limited pluralist democracy in February 1948, as I mentioned. And former democratic politicians, diplomats, high government and military officials, as well as journalists and academics, just didn't hesitate to flee abroad and to start another struggle for freedom and democracy in exile. At first, they settled in Munich, in Paris, and London, but soon after, the headquarters of the exile activities moved overseas to New York City or Washington, D.C. In December 1947, the newly formed National Security Council warned President Truman that the Soviet Union was conducting an intensive propaganda campaign directed primarily against the United States, employing coordinated psychological, political, and economic measures designed to undermine non-communist elements in Europe. The only available response to weaken and to roll back this communist influence was to initiate a psychological offensive in return. The director of the policy planning staff at the State Department, George First Kennan, presented the document called The Inauguration of Organized Political Warfare in May 1948. And Kennan highlighted the importance of providing assistance for liberal committees, underground activities behind the Iron Curtain, the support of anti-communist elements in the threatened countries of the free world. And Kennan's idea was to establish organization that would cover all information campaigns, that would launch new propaganda channels, that would unite the political emigres through a common organizational platform. And These were the beginnings of the organization called the National Committee for Europe. The founders of the nascent organization were initially not totally certain of its exact purpose and functions. They knew the committee would not provide humanitarian aid to refugees from Eastern Europe or to help with applications for US visas for those still interned in the refugee camps. Instead, it would focus on a chosen group of non-fascist and non-communist political leaders who had successfully made it to the United States to find appropriate employment and make use of their knowledge and abilities during their stay in America. The committee's articles of association were signed in New York City on May 17, 1949. You can read the 4-point program that was introduced at its first press conference in May 49. And through the founding of the National Committee for Europe, the political, organizational, and operational groundwork for all forms of anti-Soviet and anti-communist propaganda was in place. Financial aid for the National Committee for Europe's activities was assured. The donations officially came from the private persons and large corporations such as Chevrolet or Ford Motor Company, General Electric, Chase National Bank. Above all, it was the behind-the-scenes support from the State Department and from the CIA. And this was not known for many years. If you look at the chart or the program of the National Committee, it becomes obvious that really a lot of money went to exile organizations to finance their activities. And we can say that there were 3 types of political organizations active in the exile. It was the political parties, then the so-called national committees, and then the political internationals. I will explain it later, don't worry. Let me make a brief stop by the political parties. The representatives of political parties either dissolved or morphed into harmless satellites of communist parties in Eastern Europe, tried to pick up their activities in exile and to rebuild broken structures. Logically, they were working in modest surroundings with very limited funds and the lack of human apparatus. The inner organization, daily operations, publishing of official party materials, even the way of communication with the member base, all had to be radically adapted. Despite numerous problems, almost all of the exiled East European party units had began to establish themselves in the early days in the refugee camps. Here, just as an example, you can see the list of exiled socialist parties that were established in the DP camps. And party meetings were organized, basic information sheets and brochures were printed and circulated, and party structures were slowly redeveloped. The life of these exiled subjects was often turbulent and exhausted by internal problems, expulsion of dissidents, and criticism of the leadership. However, these parties retained a key role in the exile community, and the first initiatives toward supranational cooperation came from them. Let me just say that many of these political parties which had existed in the interwar period or which had operated briefly after the World War II, before the communists took power and altered party systems in their favor, made themselves known in some exile form. The other type of exile organizations were the national committees, because the integration on the basis of national umbrella organizations was perceived as a further necessary condition for the launch of really effective exile political activities. Again, as you can see, virtually every national group of emigres found its committee or council in late 1940s or early 1950s, accumulating various personalities and democratic political groups, from liberals to socialists, monarchists, and in which many similar characteristics are to be found. Typically, their management comprised the board of 15 to 20 members, recruited from among former statesmen, party and government officials, senior civil servants, etc., etc. A high percentage had also been diplomats representing their homelands in missions abroad before the communist takeovers. And once they had they received instructions from the new red governments, they often disobeyed and refused to leave their offices. And their experience and knowledge at the international level proved crucial during negotiations with Western countries and Western governments. The number of staff varied widely, depending mainly on the financial support from the National Committee for Europe. And overall, the activities of the committees consisted of lobbying American officials and compatriot associations in the interest of Eastern European emigres, participating in various cultural, educational, and memorial events, and maintaining an intensive information campaign in the media. To be sure, the most important information/propaganda channel which developed from the cooperation between US authorities and the emigre community was the Radio Free Europe. And we can all agree that the importance of its Cold War broadcasting was gradually increased. Its services provided a source of scarce objective information about what was really happening on both sides of the Iron Curtain. It also served as a think tank where emigres had the opportunity to share their ideas and analysis. It also served as a center of exile culture and as a social environment in general. At first, there were 5 national desks, Bulgarian, Czechoslovak, Hungarian, Polish, and Romanian, whose decades-long broadcasting ranked among the phenomena of modern journalism, I would say. Let me get back to the exile national committees. Again, the same problem as the political parties. They faced a constant lack of finances and internal crises and conflicts, often rooted in petty quarrels, personal animosities, arguments about the legitimacy of leading bodies, and a crippling absence of charismatic leadership. And in fact, none of these committees found itself in an ideal situation in the long run. On February 25th, 1949, exactly 1 year after the communist coup in Czechoslovakia, also the Council of Czechoslovakia was established in Washington, D.C. Former mayor of Prague, Peter Zenkel, became its chairman, and after a very promising start and a strong support from the Department of State, the activities of the council quickly shrank. It had kind of naive expectation that it would receive recognition comparable to that which the government in exile had during the World War II. Also, some tension hung in the air, the result of the defeat in February 48, frustration, fear, and unfortunately also a settling of old scores between political rivals. The fact is that the council suffered from fragmentation and conflicts which were fatally reflected in its activities. And throughout the 50s and 60s, the council was in a permanent crisis. It fell apart and reunited again, and it was very complicated. And the same or very similar situation was also in the other national committees. The same with the Bulgarians, Poles, etc., etc. The National Committee for Free Europe began to provide monthly financial support to each committee for the costs of administration, travel expenses, information, and social services. This was generous, but also a strict patron, and the money also became an effective instrument of pressure. If in subsequent years any of the committees did not respect the recommendations and demands of the National Committee for Free Europe, the Americans first appealed for and then strongly urged changes, before ultimately cutting back on their subsidies if it became clear that the desired results would not be forthcoming. And here we reached the main point, and it showed up quickly. The exile committees were not very effective in their activities. They were beset by internal problems, and many of the politicians still did not understand that they were no longer in charge, and they continued to act as if they were prime ministers or chairmen of political parties and demanded total loyalty and obedience. So American sponsors were understandably dissatisfied with these conditions, and they decided to elevate the anti-communist campaign to a higher level, represented by supranational bodies, where the Czechs, the Albanians, the Bulgarians, the Hungarians could cooperate together under one roof, could act more effectively, and of course could be more easily controlled. And in subsequent years, meaning in early 1950s, many common projects unifying the exiles came to life under the supervision of the National Committee for Free Europe. For example, there was this information campaign, Crusade for Freedom, warning the American public about the communist threat. There was the Free Europe College, providing university education to talented students among the emigres. It had the campus in this nice chateau not far from Strasbourg in France. It was the publication of the monthly journal called The News from Behind the Iron Curtain, and then the broadcasts of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. And in all of these activities, the leaders of the exile communities and the members of the national committees participated as editors, lecturers, analysts. The efforts of the National Committee for Free Europe to unite more closely East European exiles and to give the appearance that they spoke with one voice in line with US foreign policy continued and strengthened. On February 11th, 1951, altogether 202 exile representatives signed the so-called Declaration of the Aims and Principles of Liberation of the Central and Eastern European Peoples in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. It was a symbolic act, but the American public and media were very attentive to it. There were some fears that World War II and the years preceding had exposed many reasons for distrust and bitterness. Nevertheless, the complicated relations between the Czechs and the Poles, the Hungarians and the Romanians did not prevent a common front against the communist enemy. These people, the exile politicians, were ready to set out the grounds for a peaceful transition to a post-communist future, ideally involving a gradual process towards the federalization of the whole continent. And their debates and the correspondence and letters and their memoranda written in the 1950s, it all, discussed the possibility of kind of European Union. And now we have the European Union, so it's important to remind their ideas 70 years ago, because it was something we are living in now. So after the political parties and the national committees, I would like to mention the third type of organization in the exile. It was the internationals, because the visions of the Christian Democrats, agrarians, liberals, socialists, conservatives about the ideal organization of society and the development of individual countries and the entire European continent were right, logically enough. Several central themes, such as the overthrow of communist regimes and subsequent peaceful economic and political integration, remained a constant across party lines. However, specific steps to achieve their goals or the layers of society which they hoped to represent depended on the ideological beliefs of specific emigre politicians. As described earlier, the political parties in exile faced serious difficulties and had no choice but to look for allies among like-minded counterparts. And that was the impulse towards the creation of various supranational organizations, or we call them internationals, based on common ideological or professional background. To be specific, Christian Democrats in Exile founded the so-called Christian Democratic Union of Central Europe. Altogether, 18 agrarian, smallholder, and peasant parties resumed their work in exile and agreed to form or to found the International Peasant Union. The Socialists and Social Democrats had the Socialist Union. Union workers in exile were under the umbrella of the International Center of Free Trade Union in Exile, and this list can be easily expanded. Please note that it was not only, let's say, professional politicians who felt the need to be organized on a supranational level. A number of professional and guild internationals were founded for writers, for journalists, for former political prisoners, for professors, students, etc., etc. And these coordination efforts also resulted in the Assembly of Captive European Nations in New York City, which officially saw the light of day on September 20th, 1954, as a non-profit company. It was intended to act as a kind of shadow counterbalance to the United Nations. It was meant to coordinate the management of anti-communist campaigns, to publicize news from behind the Iron Curtain, and to generate the international support for the liberation of Soviet-ruled parts of Europe. It was interesting that the structure of the Assembly generally followed the structure of the United Nations. It consisted of a General Assembly, General Committee, and several working committees. And the general sessions of the Assembly were held once a year, usually in September. And these functioned as the sanctioning assemblies through which resolutions were announced and the members of the General Committee were elected. Also, various lectures and situational reports on developments in individual countries were presented, and voting on resolutions and protests took place at these sessions as well. The sessions took place in New York City to coincide with the United Nations General Assembly sessions, and were frequently coordinated with public demonstrations to raise their profile and to increase the volume of their message. Between 1956 and 1963, the Assembly rented a two-story building owned by a Carnegie Endowment on First Avenue in Manhattan, New York City, directly opposite the United Nations headquarters. Therefore, the UN delegates from communist countries simply could not avoid the unpleasant view of posters and billboards hanging across the street that alerted passers-by to the ongoing Red Terror and Soviet imperialism. The democratic and liberal politicians had made the United States the focus of their liberation efforts. The organizations I mentioned did not aspire to determine the future political and economic structure for their countries, but aimed to bring about a situation wherein their people would be able to decide without foreign interference the form of government they wanted to live under. And naturally, there were different views and disagreements about what would constitute an effective liberation. The conservative and, let's say, extremist part of exile community claimed that only a complete eradication of communism would assure it, meaning the war. The majority, however, said that many of the economic and social changes introduced under the communists would have to stay because they had become part of each nation's life. But this group demanded free elections, of course. And some emigre politicians even began to argue that liberation might well come from a gradual democratization of the communist regimes. Hopes for the liberation with the risk of an armed conflict between the United States and Soviet Union ran probably highest during the 1952 American presidential election or campaign between Dwight Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson. And during this presidential campaign, there was much talk about the liberation. And I guess that the votes from American Czechs, Poles, Hungarians sent the Republican candidate to the White House because they simply expected that Eisenhower, as a war hero who saw what was happening in Central Europe after or at the end of World War II, that he would take a tough stance against the Soviets. After Stalin's death in March 1953, it seemed that opportunities for change in particular countries of the socialist bloc would open up. As you know, the first attempts were seen in the German Democratic Republic, where in June 1953 there were serious social protests which involved about 400,000 people in over 250 locations across the country, including East Berlin. But they were pacified very quickly as a result of the Soviet military intervention. This was a serious blow to the hopes and naive expectations of the emigres. The other one was the Geneva Summit of July 1955, where the representatives of the Big Four, meaning the United States, the Soviet Union, France, and Great Britain, met for the first time in a decade following the end of World War II. Before the conference, the Western leaders were literally swamped with telegrams and various resolutions from various exile organizations demanding that the problem of liberation be put on the agenda. Although Eisenhower seemed to be open to the suggestion, the issue of liberation was not raised in Geneva. Moreover, the conference was followed by a period of disappointments. Communist Albania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania were admitted to the United Nations, and the failure of the West to intervene effectively in the Polish and above all in the Hungarian uprising in late 1956 raised the question whether there was a room for political exiles and their activities in the world where conflicting systems tolerated one another. Well, the Cold War and the communist supremacy over Eastern Europe lasted more than 4 decades, and the majority of the fighters for freedom and democracy didn't live to see the fall of the Iron Curtain in the fall of 1989. Therefore, we historians need to catalog their efforts and make sure that their work will not be forgotten. And I thank you for your attention and looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
I'm off mic. That was terrific. Thank you so much for that presentation, Martin. Actually, before we open up things for questions, I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about the Czech citizenship issue that I just briefly touched on at the beginning of the presentation this evening.
The thing I didn't mention is that I'm involved in the project called the Czechoslovak Talks. You can check our website. It's available both in Czech and English. If you type czechoslovaktalks.com/en, like English, you will see the website. We simply collect inspiring and interesting life stories of Czechs abroad. Now we have about 30 stories, and it's incredible what these people had to go through. We have stories of the people who left Bohemia, Czechia, in late 19th century, even under the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Then the ones who left for economic reasons in the interwar period during the Big Depression. Then the Jews who escaped from Hitler after 1938. Then we call them 48ers who left after 48. And then the last or the newest generation of emigres, the ones who left after 1968. So it's incredible to collect these stories. We also prepare the comic book, to attract younger readers and students in this topic. And this project was funded by Dr. Horthy, who is a Prague lawyer, and he has a law firm that assists for more than 2 decades to the Czechs abroad, to compatriots with the dual citizenship, with inheritance, and with various issues. And now we are asked by many Czech Americans or by many Czechs living in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, who want the Czech citizenship back, or they want it for the children or their grandchildren. What should they do? It was very complicated in past few years, but since last September we have this novel or this new Czech citizenship law that enables to receive the Czech citizenship very easily. Let me tell you the case. There was a guy who emigrated in 1950s as a young boy, and because he illegally left the country, he lost the Czechoslovak citizenship. He settled in Canada. He stayed there for the rest of his life. He got married. He had kids and grandchildren, and now the kids and grandchildren would like to become Czechs, or better to say, would like to have the Czech passport, because that opens the door to the whole European Union, and that's useful. So he asked us what to do. Is it complicated to apply for Czech citizenship? Is it even, are we even eligible? So there are many questions, and the law firm of Dr. Horky has really a lot to do. So we put together this short informative text. Maybe Eleanor could share it with you. So let me know. You can contact me on my email if you also have a Czech origin, or if you know someone who was born in Czechoslovakia, then lost the Czechoslovak citizenship, and might be interested to get the Czech citizenship for the kids or for grandchildren. It's still complicated, but it's not impossible. We would be happy to assist you, because obviously you need to have some document, some proof that you were really born in Czechoslovakia. So some research in the local archives needs to be done, but we are here to assist you and to help you with that if necessary. So let me know.
Great. Yeah, I will make sure to send that as a follow-up. I was waiting till after this lecture, so I'll make sure to do that. Is it okay for me to also share your email address, Martin?
Yeah, sure, definitely.
Okay. All right. I do have a question that came in on chat from one of the participants this evening, Terry Skelton, and he had a question for you about what books have you written, and can you give us the name of those? Or if you want to send a list afterwards, I can always post that as well.
I will. Unfortunately, my books are in Czech language only, but I wrote many articles and papers in English, so I'll be more than happy to share these.
Okay, that'd be great. I have a question, actually. In listening to this, first of all, I did not appreciate about the significant exile activity, but it was, obviously really prolific after the Iron Curtain came down. And it makes me kind of think that, a lot of this history, I certainly didn't know it. And I certainly can't imagine that a lot of people, particularly some of the younger generations in the US, are quite aware of this. And I'm wondering if you could comment on what you're observing, kind of the going on here in the States today, and a lot of renewed interest, I think, among some of the younger generation here in sort of a romanticism about socialism and communism, and which I think, my opinion, is a rather dangerous thing to be embracing. But not sure if you have any advice to the youth today in the U.S.
Well, I don't want to call myself an expert, because when the Iron Curtain fell down, I was just a little shaver. I was born in 1982, and so I was like 6 years old. I was a first grader, but still I remember some details. I remember Prague. That it's the most beautiful city in the world. But back in 1980s, it was a gray, foggy city. Everything was covered by dust. Everything was under construction. It was a really depressing place where to live. So this is kind of the fragments from my memory on communist times. The advice I would give to American students, well, you should read you should study. There are still many materials in the American archives. As I said at the beginning, this topic is almost unexplored field, so I feel as a researcher, also as an explorer, because I'm really, in most of the cases, I'm the first historian who's reading the old papers and the letters and the situational reports the emigres put together back in 1950s. And for you, it's good that most of the material, the relevant material, is available in American archives and libraries. I did a lot of research in the Library of Congress, in the archives of Columbia University. There is a great place where to do research. It's called the IHRC, the Immigration History Research Center at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. Obviously, Hoover Institute at Stanford. They have dozens of collections related to the Eastern European emigres. So I have some colleagues from Poland and Hungary who also want to or are trying to do research and to write many articles to present the topic and to popularize the topic at the conferences and in the media. But it's a never-ending process. And well, for you, it's good that Central and Eastern European countries are still cheap for you. You can live in Prague like a kings. You can have a cheap beer. So it's very popular among the American students who come for a semester or just for a short visit, and they can visit our museums and archives and see how the communist regime looked like and how the socialism looked like. Particularly in Czechoslovakia, it's complicated to explain it, to Americans with completely different historic experience.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to open up for any other questions that the group may have. If you do have a question, please unmute your microphone, because I have everyone muted right now, and please feel free to ask away. Or if it's easier to put something in chat, that also works as well, and I can repeat the questions. No questions? This group is a quiet group, my goodness.
I don't bite.
Eleanor?
Yes.
Eleanor, it's Dan. I have two questions.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. My first question is, was there some type of fence or border or like a wall or something around the entire country to keep people in, similar to, I guess, what you would see at the Berlin Wall? You can answer that, and I have a second question.
Yes, from 1951 there was a barbed wire, surrounding the western border. If I go back in my presentation, if it's still possible, back to the map, you can see the western border of Czechoslovakia. With yeah, here we are. Oops. Yeah, you can see that in the southwestern part, it's called the Shumava Mountains, or well, yeah, Shumava Mountains in English. There was the border region. On the other side of the hills or the mountains, there was Bavaria, which was the American occupation zone. So that was the most frequently used way how to escape from Czechoslovakia, and the communists were very well aware of it. So from 1951 on, they start to build the barbed wire and the minefields, and they were bodyguards with the shepherds with the dogs. So it was very dangerous and complicated to go through, but it was still possible because there were deep forests, and if you were lucky, then it was night and it was winter, you could get through. Yeah, it was really difficult for the people from Moravia, which is the eastern part, and for the people from Slovakia, and we don't see it the map now. It was easier and shorter to get to Austria, but again, the two Austrian regions bordering with Czechoslovakia, they were under the Soviet rule. It was the Soviet occupation zone. So the people had to make it to Vienna, to the Western occupation sectors. It was the same like in Berlin. There were 4 occupation sectors in Vienna, but it was about 60, maybe 70 kilometers to get there. So it happened very often that the refugees were just stopped by the Soviet patrols and they were sent back to the Czechoslovak border. So again, it was very complicated. And the third, the hardest way was to make it to West Berlin. But again, as you can see on the map, the Eastern Germany, there were Soviet troops, and it was even longer way to get there. So yeah, many people were caught, and many people were imprisoned for their try to escape from the communist paradise.
Okay, and my second question was, in the beginning, you said when the Czech Republic was formed, it was through a charter in Pittsburgh, and I think you said it was in 1819. But what's the, I don't understand, what was the Pittsburgh connection and why is that significant?
Yeah, we had another
yeah.
question about that too.
Yeah, 1918, Professor Masaryk, who was kind of the leader of Czechoslovak resistance and exile, moved or left Bohemia in late 1914. He was in Italy, France, then he moved to Great Britain, and from May 1918 he started to negotiate with American politicians because he was in Chicago, and then he moved to New York City and then Cleveland and other places, and he understood that he needs some kind of understanding or cooperation with very influential compatriot organizations in the United States. As I mentioned, there were hundreds of thousands of people of Slovak or Czech or Ruthenian origin living in the United States. And Masaryk understood that he needs to show some kind of agreement, some kind of contract between these three ethnic groups or these 3 nations, that they agree that they would form common republic in Central Europe. And this Pittsburgh Agreement was a kind of memorandum of understanding completed on May 31st, 1918, between the members of the Czech and Slovak compatriot communities, and it prescribed the intent of the co-signatories to create an independent Czechoslovakia. This document was presented to President Wilson and also to the US Congress. So the American politicians said, well, now Masaryk and his group, they are not individuals, they have some support of the local Czech and Slovak communities, so let's support them. There are details about Pittsburgh Agreement on Wikipedia, or there were some articles written in English. There was also a Cleveland Agreement back in 1915. There was the very first kind of memorandum of understanding. So feel free to check it online. It was complicated, because Masaryk came in as a private person, as an outlaw, who would have been imprisoned in Austria. So he had, at the beginning, he had no support, no money, and it was the American Czechs who financed his activities at the beginning. So again, it's very important to remind the efforts of the Czech American community during both world wars. The same situation was after 1939, when Czechoslovakia was occupied by the Germans. The second president, Edvard Beneš, also came to the exile, also arrived to the United States and asked the Czech Americans to help him, and they did the same thing as in 1918. They raised a lot of money, about $2 million, and thanks to this money, Beneš and his colleagues were able to finance the Czechoslovak Foreign Legions and to start to launch the anti-Nazi resistance from abroad. So this is the same situation. Almost no one knows that today. The students know nothing about this assistance or help of Czech Americans. So I feel it as my duty and as my task to give lectures at high schools and the universities to present this topic, to talk about famous Czech Americans and the communities in New York City, in Chicago, in Cleveland, in Texas, because thanks to them we had Czechoslovak Republic and we had our freedom.
Okay, thank you very much.
I have another question from someone who this is from 200010, so their name wasn't listed, but this person had a question about, can you talk more about those who defected in 1968 and what were the consequences for family left behind in Czechoslovakia?
Of course, it was not so dangerous to escape, because who tried to escape in 1950s and was caught, he was put into prison for 10 years, for 15 years, or even for 20 years. Who tried it in 1960s, he had some troubles. He was fired from job and his kids were not allowed to study, for example, but he could survive. And as I said, after or in the period between 1948 and 1968, it was about 120, 130,000 people who left, and the same number after the Soviet invasion. As you know, Czechoslovakia was invaded by 5 armies of the Warsaw Pact in August 68 as a punishment for the process of liberalization called the Prague Spring. It was kind of an attempt to have own Czechoslovak version of socialism. We called it socialism with the human face, and the Soviet Politburo didn't like that. So the invasion was the result. And it was in the middle of the summer, or at the end of the summer, so many people were abroad. It was possible to travel abroad in the late 1960s. So many people left for Yugoslavia or for Italy, and the terrible news about the occupation were announced in the Western media, and they had to decide within a few hours whether they should get back to Czechoslovakia or whether they stay in Western Europe. So we called this generation or this wave 68ers, and many people stayed in Western Europe. Many people left for Australia again, for South Africa, for Canada. It's a completely different story. It's another generation of emigres, and it's difficult to compare these two generations because there were some specifics, and they didn't talk to each other very much because logically, the old generation, they were the ones who were expelled by the communists abroad, and the new generation, it was the people with some 20 years of experience of life under the communist rule or under the communist regime. So their philosophy and their worldviews were a bit different from the ones who left in 1940s. But the same had the Poles or the Hungarians. There was a wave of Hungarian exile in 1946. Then after the revolution in 1956, the same with the Poles who left in the late 40s and then in 60s and in 1981. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, the exile studies, it's a great phenomenon and a great field for research.
Yeah. Are you continuing? Obviously, it sounds like that has been a focus of your study most recently. So I'm assuming that work, is continuing. How has the I know that you would come over here to the States fairly frequently. I'm assuming part of that would be the opportunity to continue some research. How has this pandemic impacted that at this point?
Well, I usually come to the US twice a year or 3 times a year to do research and also to give lectures at American universities. Well, I should have stayed in the US for a month in April. There were 9 or 10 university lectures scheduled. All of it was cancelled for obvious reasons, or hopefully not cancelled, but just postponed. My flight ticket is rebooked for September 27th, so I still hope I will be able to get to the US in the fall, but I'm getting more and more dubious. So if it doesn't work out this fall, I'll be there next spring for sure.
Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed. I think it's all my travel's been put on hold for this year, so I've been spending a lot of time at home. And any other questions? Does anyone have any other questions? I have one last one that came in. If we don't, anyone else? All right. Well, this one last question. Again from Terry. He's like, can you make any recommendations for any good Czech restaurants in the States when you're over here?
Sure. If you guys visit New York City, there is a Bohemian National Hall at 73rd Street in Upper East Side, and just next to the building, there is a Czech consulate and there is an exhibition hall, and it's a kind of part of our history, because this building was constructed in 1890s, so it's part of history. And just next to this building is the Czech restaurant. It's called Praha, if I'm not mistaken, and you can get the duck with the dumplings, and the cabbage soup and other Czech specialties. So if you guys go to New York City, don't forget to make a stop there to have a dinner. Yeah.
All right, fantastic. Well, I know it's quite late for you, and you've been very gracious in hanging with us today. So we really want to thank you for speaking. And I know that you have some other topics, so I may be maybe getting back in touch with you maybe in 2021 to have you do another lecture. If not live, at least by webinar, but hopefully live someday. So again, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for indulging us this evening. And I think that's about it. So remember, everyone, next month, second Thursday in August, I will be giving a lecture about the space race in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and doing a virtual tour of the centrifuge. So thanks again, everyone, and have a good evening. All right. Number 2 down. Thank you. All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night.